Thanks, Andy. You stole my gag about robotic voices. Thanks very much indeed, folks, for coming along this evening and listening to us talking about excavating Avebury. Now, the lecture tonight is in two halves. I'm Mark Gillings. I'm going to be doing the first half, and then Josh is going to jump in and take over to talk you through the second half. Now, in the first part, we're going to be looking at historical excavations of Avebury. So, how much archaeological excavation has taken place at Avebury? Why is more critically needed? And I'll give you an introduction for those of you who've not had the joy of visiting the site, a sense of what Avebury is and what Avebury is all about. I'm then going to hand over to Josh after about 25 minutes, who's going to give you a taste of the field work we've been carrying out in the Avebury landscape over the last few years. And Josh is going to talk you through the new understandings that are starting to emerge from that. So, without further ado, let me dive in. The key points I want to make really in this first half are that we don't know as much about Avebury as we think we should. And we don't know as much about Avebury as we probably would like. 20th century and later excavation within the henge and around the henge has been sorely limited. As you'll see, much of the excavation that has been carried out at scale has been confined to the first half of the 20th century. So we haven't dug as much as people think. Secondly, there's been a tendency to forget things that we originally knew or thought we knew, and I'll give you an example of that shortly. As a result, knowledge about Avebury has often gained authority as much through repetition than the results of rigorous fieldwork. If people say the church ordered stones to be buried enough, people will believe that the church ordered stones to be buried, when the archaeological evidence might be telling us something very different. So really, the end result, we don't know as much as we think. And that's going to be the motif really for this first part of the session. So what is Avebury? It's the largest prehistoric stone circle in Europe, if not the world. And you can see it there in its glorious majesty, sitting within this beautiful chalk downland landscape. It's a large and deliciously complex site. It's busy, and it sits within an equally busy prehistoric landscape. You can see here on the image, we've got earthworks, we've got rings of standing stones around the edge, we've got rings of standing stones within the interior, and then we've got complex arrangements of stones within the rings within the rings. And we've also got a village running through the middle of it. It's a very busy place. And to give you an idea, these are the earthworks as photographed in about 1908 by Harold St. George Gray, and this is his wife and young child sprawled upon the surviving bank. And here's a shot of the bank to the left and the ditch taken more recently. This is a reconstruction of what we think the earthwork may have looked like when originally constructed. And the key take-home message is it's huge. It's absolutely vast. The bank reaching a height of about a maximum of, say, 6 meters, the ditch descending to a maximum depth of about 10 meters. So this is monumental in every sense. And when you imagine that all of that was dug out using antler picks and cattle scapular shovels and baskets, you get a real kind of sense of the scale of this undertaking. So we have a huge earthwork surrounding the site. Within that, we have a circle of around about 100 stones. So this site diameter is about 460 meters. So it's huge, absolutely huge. And running around the edge, we have these enigmatic megaliths, typically about 15 tons, standing to 1.5 meters to a couple of meters in height. Within this outer circle, we have the inner circles, and here's the part of the southern inner circle, larger, more imposing megaliths, still huge in terms of the scale of the circle, but dwarfed by that outer ring. And within the center of those, there are even larger megalithic settings. So here we've got the cove in the northern inner circle. So we have circles within circles, and we have settings within circles sitting at the heart of the monument. Along with Dorrington Walls, Marden, Mount Pleasant, it's one of 4 enormous late Neolithic henge sites, often referred to as mega henges. And as far as the dating goes at the moment, first phase of bank, probably looking around 3000 BC, the main earthwork around 2006, the outer circle of stones 2006, 100 BC, the innermost settings potentially earlier, perhaps 3100. And then running from the henge, lines of paired sanding stones, which may come towards the end of the construction sequence around 2006, 100 BC. So construction potentially spanning a period of 500 years, if not more. And this is a reconstruction of Avebury in its landscape. Avebury is sitting there, circles within circles. Running out from it are lines of paired standing stones to connect it to other monuments in the landscape. So this is the West Kennet Avenue, 2.5 kilometres. From the west, the Beckhampton Avenue runs for about 1.5 kilometres to join up with the Longstones enclosure. And within the broader Avebury landscape, we have Windmill Hill, we have Silbury Hill, we have the West Kennet Palisade enclosures. We have a host of really monumental, in-your-face monumental structures of chalk, earth, timber, and stone. So that's a pretty incredible landscape. The trouble we have with understanding Avebury is that not much of the original structure survived into the 20th century. And on the left, you have a tentative reconstruction of what it might have looked like in terms of stones when originally constructed. To the right, you have what was left by the early 1930s. And you can see there are odd stones dotted about and a badly degraded earthwork. So one of the reasons we have trouble understanding Avebury is that it had suffered quite dramatically during a couple of periods of later history. When John Aubrey, guy in the wig, discovered the site in 1649, so when it was first recognised as being something archaeological, a number of the stones making up the monument had already disappeared. They'd been deliberately toppled and then buried and hidden in graves, deliberately cut pits next to their standing position, and then covered up as if they were never there. And we know that this burial process went on for a few hundred years, probably dating or beginning around the early 14th century, but extending into the 16th. So Avebury had already been partly dismantled by the time it was first discovered. In the 18th century, much of the stone fabric of Avebury was broken and smashed, and the early antiquarian William Stukely was recording it whilst it was being dismantled around him. And you can see here a quite evocative image of a stone being burned and broken. And the broken stone is all around you if you visit Avebury today. And you can see it here, the blocks making up the walls of various structures and buildings within the henge. So Avebury is a difficult site insofar as it suffered serious kind of depredation prior to it being first recognised and recorded as an archaeological monument. But it's also suffered from a complete lack of large-scale excavation. And this little plot here summarises all of the holes that have been dug at Avebury, pretty much. And you can see the most extensive is the orange, with the green in the earthwork, with odd little blue antiquarian fertiles going on within the interior. Very little of the henge has actually been excavated. Burl estimated only 6% of the interior has ever had a hole dug in it by an archaeologist. And the key thing to note is the dating here. The latest of those trenches that's marked is 1960. The majority were the first half of the 20th century. So we've dug very little. And as a result, our understanding is based on that early 20th century record. And as a result, And I quote Whittle, "The fame of the area has run far ahead of basic archaeological understanding." It's one of those sites we think we know more about than we do. And Biddle's quote here is really, really important, I think, because we cannot conserve what we do not understand. We cannot manage what we do not understand. We cannot effectively communicate what we do not understand. And when it comes to Avebury, we do not understand. Now, I mentioned earlier we have a habit of forgetting stuff when it comes to Avebury. And I can give you one example of that. And in 2003, the newspapers reported that National Trust archaeologists had discovered an ark of buried stones that once formed part of the Great Stone Circle at Avebury. And I quote, "This is a truly exciting find and completes the circle. Until now, no one had realized that some of these stones had survived intact and that they buried in the earth next to their original locations." Only they had. In 1881, the antiquarians Lucas and Smith dug them up. They probed for them. They even put little wooden markers on saying stone buried here around that side of the henge. How on earth are we able to forget that? And I would argue that our knowledge of Avebury currently comprises a very heady cocktail of certainties, things we're pretty confident about, that have been proven or demonstrated through excavation, ambiguities, stuff people have found but not quite understood, or geophysical surveys which reveal anomalies, not answers, speculations, stuff we think might be there, and fictions, stuff people really want to be there, whether that's driven by their own preconceptions and desires or the archaeological record. So rather than a definitive story, we have a cocktail, a soup of certainties, ambiguities, speculations, and fictions. And that perhaps explains why modern academic work in disciplines like anthropology prefers to work with 18th century records of Avebury than it does the modern excavated data we do actually have. So what is our current understanding based upon? Really, it's work carried out in the early 20th century by Harold St George Gray on behalf of the British Association for the Advancement of Science that was designed to investigate the age of stone circles. And there's Gray looking waxed in the moustache department, and he's standing next to a survey pole. And Gray, I say Gray, the workman here, carried out a program of excavation between 1908 and 1922. The First World War got in the way, unfortunately, and Gray was seeking to date the monument. He was also aided by his wife and his young child, who helped with survey and recording of the site. And you get a sense from the archive image here of the scale of this. This was big scale stuff. They were digging holes on a scale around the earthwork of the monument. And I hope you can see that they're opening up fairly, substantial holes. And here you can get a sense of the depth of the ditch and how we know how deep that feature was, as these workmen are diligently digging their way down and down and down. And you can see here in this ditch section, the flat bottom, you can see a weathering, a stabilization horizon or two here. Everything that's above the little laser dot is post-Roman. Everything underneath is pre-Roman. And the little workman gives you a sense of scale. In his diary and written on the back of these photos, Gray comments, "A ton of soil collapsed in from the section that evening." When it comes to these, he notes that 10 tons of chalk collapsed from this section not long after the workmen had actually climbed out. And can you see the little chap down the bottom there? I think it's fair to say, Josh, health and safety and risk assessments were treated in a different fashion back then. But hopefully you get a sense of the scale. He also investigated the bank, but to a lesser extent. The focus was mainly on the ditch. When it came to the stones, he only looked at one, and that was to excavate roughly around a fallen megalith. And you can see his jolly workman sitting there, having cleared the ground around, and then the reasonably useful drawing that Gray produced as a consequence. Now, you saw how large the scale of that work looked in the photos, but it's the green patches marked on the screen here. It's tiny when we think of the scale of the site as a whole. But he succeeded in dating Avebury to the prehistoric period. So it achieved its aims, and it was published. But the second major phase of excavation work took place in the 1930s under the aegis of the marmalade magnate Alexander Keeler, sitting in his little hut on the left. And Keeler's work was again carried out at scale. This is large-scale excavation and was technically excellent and experimental, really, in the archaeological methods that it employed. And it was ambitious. It had the goal of really bringing Avebury back to life. To give you an idea of just how mischievous and experimental it was, we see half tracks trundling around the Avebury landscape. We see experiments with wheelbarrow wheels, where we have the iron-bound wheel, a pneumatic, and tank track wheelbarrow wheels. A lot of mischief and a lot of experiment. And if Gray had focused on the earthwork, the ditch, with a look at the bank, Keeler focused more on the stones and the megaliths. And this beautiful cartoon by Dennis Grant King was drawn in 1939 as they were excavating and restoring the megalithic settings of the southern inner circle. And here we can see some of that work, and you can compare this to the photo I showed you a while ago of Gray's workmen. Here's Keeler's team of local labourers excavating a hidden standing stone that formerly stood in the West Kennet Avenue. So that's probably 1935. And here you can see the efforts Keeler's team went to put the stones back up. Stones that had fallen, stones that had been deliberately toppled, and stones that had been buried. And here are his team doing precisely that. Levering a stone back into position, restoring, bringing back to life this prehistoric monument. And here again, we can see his team excavating a hidden stone. This reconstruction became almost obsessional. Where stones had broken, Keeler's team would insert metal pegs and literally glue the stones together. They would haul them into position, twist them and tweak them, and then pack them with concrete so they couldn't move again. And here you can see a stone being levered down onto its base, clamped together, and then sealed in a little concrete pad. I particularly like this photo. It shows you one of the megaliths within Avebury, sitting within its concrete base, with a chap who looks like he's walked out of a nightclub in 1983. Not that I ever went to a nightclub in 1983. So the Avebury we see today, and the Avebury you can wander around, and the Avebury you can hug the stones, owes a lot to the work of Alexander Keeler's team in bringing it back to life. And this is a photograph of the never reached southwest quadrant. That's it as you wander around it today. Slightly different angle, but that's it, hosing down the stones after they've been set in concrete back in 38. You get the drift. Now, Keeler's work is the orange, and you can see it's focusing on the rings of stones and the settings and the interior. He did look at the ditch and the bank, but the focus is really the stones. And the trouble with Keeler's work is that he generated a fantastic amount of data, but it was never really fully published in the kind of detail archaeologists crave and look for. There was a brilliant broad brush summary published by Isabel Smith in 1965, but beyond that, the detail has never really been accessed. The post-excavation program, again, never completed, and that's because the Second World War got in the way. There seems to be a pattern of large-scale fieldwork at Avebury interrupted by world wars, but we'll not dwell on that one. And the Keeler archive survives in the Avebury Museum. We have a host of bits and bobs, drawn records, photograph albums, finds, thousands of finds, thousands and thousands and thousands of finds. And the Avebury Papers project, which is now coming to an end, there's an exhibition on at the Art Gallery in Southampton at the moment, is all about finishing that process of post-excavation and bringing the Keeler records to full publication. So for the first time, we'll have the detail of those 1930s excavations available to all of us, to archaeologists, to members of the public, to artists, to pretty much anyone interested in the site. And to give you a sense of the scale, the Avebury Papers have digitized just under 18,000 documents, 4,000 photos, have transcribed over 1 million words from handwritten letters and notes and diaries, and they've researched over 200 people. The workmen who you see in those photographs, we now know who they were, what their hopes and desires for the site were, and we can put them back into the story of this amazing place. So, certainties. Well, they're rare at Avebury because we've dug so little of it. Ambiguities are many. Speculations, well, they're rife. And fictions are plentiful. So, how do we resolve that? Well, one of the answers is to dig more holes. And digging of holes takes us on to the second part, and I'll hand you over to my colleague, Josh.
Hey, thank you, Mark. So I shall now attempt to share the screen, okay, and pick up from where Mark has left. So this is going to be a quick potted account of work that Mark and I have been undertaking actually for quite a while now. It sort of takes us back to the late 1990s, and very much sort of stimulated by an awareness that there was still an awful lot to learn, not just about Avebury itself, but also about other monuments within the wider Avebury landscape. As Mark pointed out, the monument isn't there in isolation, but it's part of a complex of late Neolithic monuments, including avenues, Silbury Hill, the Palisades, the Sanctuary, and so forth. And those in turn are set within a landscape which had seen a lot of early Neolithic occupation and especially tomb building, that taking us back into the 4th millennium BC. So what we've been doing is work which really sort of contextualizes Avebury from the outside. We have had one opportunity to dig in the site itself, but much of what we're going to describe relates to work outside. But it all feeds into our understanding of the monument itself. So this has been done through a couple of projects, really. First of all, we ran something called the Longstones Project, which looked at one of the avenues that belongs to the Avebury Henge, the Beckhampton Avenue, which had been recorded in the early 18th century by the antiquary William Stukely, but in a very sorry state. And over time, its existence actually became a kind of matter of faith, really. And we came up with a very simple way of working out whether or not it existed or not by going off and digging it up. But we also had an opportunity to look at part of the West Kennett Avenue, sites like the Faulkner's Circle to the south of Avebury, and also through serendipity, some work at the Avebury Cove. Now, following on from that, we had two projects which are really kind of one and the same, sort of between the monuments, living with monuments, which are about trying to understand the way in which living in the landscape was implicated in its monumentalization. So how making monuments led to the landscape being occupied in the way it was, but also how the traces of occupation within the landscape actually led in some instances to their monumentalization. And as we'll see at the end, how that can actually help explain the beginnings of Avebury. So lots of different sites there, mostly kind of settlement related sites like on the West Kennett Avenue, Avebury Down and so forth. But also we did investigate one of the elements of the monument complex, the West Kennett Palisades. and we'll explore the reason for that as we go on. And work goes on. So even outside those projects, we've been doing odd bits of work. For example, just sampling bits of the landscape quite close to Avebury, in the Manor Parkland, in the Winterbourne, just to the west of the monument, and so forth. So the Longstones project take us back to 1999, and we were kind of rather bold at the time and kind of just barged our way into the landscape and basically sort of decided we would find out whether or not this second megalithic avenue existed. Sure enough, it was there. It was there pretty much as William Stukeley had suggested, albeit not running for quite the length that Stukeley envisaged. He was playing around with ideas that the Beckhampton Avenue should be symmetrical in its format to the West Kennet Avenue. We were able to pin down the Beckhampton Avenue as a shorter avenue, but still about 1.5 kilometres in length, and one that ran from the western entrance of the Henge off to what are known as the Longstones, in a field near Beckhampton, terminating in a box-like setting known as a cove. We were also able to demonstrate that the avenue and the Longstones Cove, or the end of the avenue and the Longstones Cove, were superimposed on a slightly earlier earthwork enclosure, a very short-lived monument that may have been linked to kind of gathering and feasting and various other kinds of events, which was then levelled over, and then the avenue was constructed over the top of it. Saying something about, if you like, the kind of significance of this as a place, and perhaps the reason why it terminates here is the fact that it's next to at least 2 earlier Neolithic long barrows, and other features that may have marked it out as being somewhere that was sort of ancestrally important in various ways. But we did get this chance to actually sort of dig in Avebury itself, and this wasn't originally part of the project, but the opportunity arose because it had been recognised that the 2 remaining stones of the cove inside the northern inner circle of the Avebury monument, representing, if you like, the largest stones inside the monument, they were beginning to lean at a slightly sort of precarious angle. And the National Trust and English Heritage, as it then was, were worried that eventually one or both stones would fall over, potentially squashing some tourists in the process. And so they did what anyone would do, and that's to fence them off and then spend several years trying to work out the best course of action. Anyway, it was decided the best course of action was to actually sort of push the stones back up, but it was recognised that doing that would disturb deposits under the ground. And so we were lucky that we were offered the job, as it were, of excavating at the foot of these stones, during the process of them being sort of pushed upright and consolidated. Now, one of the stones was clearly on its way over. It was very shallowly set in the ground, and it was leaning at an angle and was about to fall. The biggest stone, though, which is the sort of western stone, which is the one you see on the left-hand side, photo, although it's leaning, we were able to point out that it had always been leaning since the Neolithic. And also we were able to observe that actually this is a monster. This is buried 3 meters or so into the ground. Part of that depth is made up by later 19th century kind of makeup of the ground surface and so forth, but it's still set a good 1.5 meters or so into the solid chalk. And the engineers who were doing the consolidation work made an estimate that this stone probably weighs in the order of about 100 tons or so, making it certainly probably the largest stone within the Avebury complex, and conceivably one of the largest standing stones within prehistoric Britain. Now, we're also lucky that we're able to get what's called an optically stimulated luminescence date from the packing in this stone. And that came back with a very surprising result at the time, which suggested that it had been set up at the end of the 4th millennium BC, so in what we'd call the Middle Neolithic. And this would suggest that it belonged to the very beginnings of Avebury as a monument. At the time, the date seemed quite anomalous, but now we know from other work in other complexes at places like Stonehenge and in the Boyne Valley and so forth, that there was a lot going on around 3100 BC, and clearly the first stages of the Avebury complex actually kind of belong within that horizon. So we were able to sort of contribute to understanding something about the kind of development of the henge itself, but we're also kind of aware that we had to be kind of holistic in how we looked at the monument. We're also aware that it'd be very difficult to get further permission to do excavation within Avebury. So out into the landscape we went, and we looked at all sorts of varied traces. And certainly with the Living with Monuments project, we were interested in that relationship between the way the landscape was occupied and monument building. So, for example, how building monuments might draw people into this landscape, sometimes in very large numbers for short periods of time, but also how traces of living in this landscape might themselves become monumentalized and might begin to help us understand why this landscape became so special. We're also interested as well in how monuments related to natural phenomena. So this was at the start of the Neolithic landscape, which included bits of woodlands, it included seasonal streams, but also it included a lot of natural sarsen stones that we used to make the Avebury circles, which were present in spreads around this area. And so how did people sort of negotiate these natural features? What was their status? How did they understand them? These were the themes that we wanted to investigate. Now, this was an exercise in trying to sort of tackle the landscape. It involved bits of survey, it involved bits of excavation. With excavation, you have to target sites. There's a limit to how much physically you can dig. But when it comes to doing things like environmental sampling and geophysical survey, you've got much bigger parts of the landscape to play with. So we involved a colleague, Philippe de Smet from the University of Ghent, who used a technique called EMI to survey the landscape. And the purpose of this was to use that technique in order to understand where buried deposits might lie within valleys, to, if you like, allow us to reconstruct something of the kind of topography of that landscape during the Neolithic, which has since been smoothed out a lot through agricultural activity, but also allow us to see where deposits existed that might provide traces of buried archaeology, quite well preserved archaeology. And certainly when we're looking at evidence of Neolithic settlement, we have this curious kind of contradiction, as it were, that these communities were perfectly able to build very substantial monuments out of stone, out of timber, out of earthworks. But when it came to the architecture of the living, we have very ephemeral traces. We often have just scatters of artifacts, often work flint. When we excavate these sites, we might find pits, we might find occasional stake holes and post holes. But it's quite hard and quite difficult archaeology to find and also interpret, as opposed to the very visible elements of the monuments that these people built to deal with their dead, or to mark places, or to act as foci for ceremony. Now, it's important as well to understand something about the environment at the time, and so this is where colleagues Mike Allen and Charlie French came on board, doing lots of environmental sampling, lots of augering, lots of drilling holes in the landscape to look at the nature of kind of deposits across this area. And one of the key findings that they came out with was that here around Avebury, as they've also found around the monument complexes at Stonehenge and Knowlton on Cranbourne Chase, that these were landscapes at the start of the Neolithic that probably weren't particularly heavily wooded. They might have had light, patchy woodland in them, but they were quite open environments. And it's likely that it's these open environments which were attracting incoming Neolithic farmers into these regions and leading to them gaining in significance and importance. And we've pointed out, Philippe, we've pointed out Mike and Charlie. We should mention that with all this field work, it's always teamwork. It's always involved lots of colleagues coming in with all sorts of different specialisms. And really, this is a massive kind of collective exercise that goes on. So you can see here some of the sites that we excavated. You can see Avebury up at the top there, and you can see these other locations which represent sites kind of on hilltops, on the sides of valleys, in the bottom of some of the river valley systems, and some sites being settlement sites, other sites being places of flint extraction, as at Knoll Down, other locations being monumental, as with the West Kennet Palisades, but having an intimate connection to that business of people coming into and occupying this landscape. Now, a lot of what we were looking for with the settlement sites were these spreads of artifacts, so-called flint scatters, which tend to receive less sort of attention over the last sort of couple of decades as they had back in the 70s and 80s. And we took the approach that sort of digging parts of these flint scatters in detail would be a useful way of understanding their structure, and also being able to understand something of the kind of date and range of activity that was happening in these locations. And this is just to explain that we weren't really just setting out to play chess on a giant scale. Lots of digging of squares. Now, we started off actually following in the footsteps of Keeler. And the first site that we investigated was along the West Kennet Avenue. And this was actually a location which marked the beginning of Keeler's Avebury excavations back in 1934. Whoop, back it goes. And when Keeler began excavating the West Kennet Avenue with the intention of finding the stones and restoring the avenue, what he immediately found was actually a very dense concentration of Neolithic flint work and also pottery. At the time, this was interpreted as late Neolithic and interpreted as representing settlement that immediately predated the construction of the avenue. We now know actually this relates to settlement that predates the avenue by several centuries. But we're quite surprised looking at Keeler's material at just how well preserved it all was. For finds that came out of what was effectively the topsoil, everything seemed to be in very, very fresh condition. It looked as though all this stuff had not been disturbed by ploughing, which make it quite a remarkable site. So we ended up excavating in between the areas where Keeler had dug, and we found the reason why all this stuff was so well preserved is thanks to earthworms, which had basically taken all the objects which were originally deposited on the surface in the Neolithic and carefully sorted them or brought them down to the base of the soil horizon below the level of later ploughing, which meant that we had, in a compressed fashion, these in situ spreads of middens and refuse deposits which related to this occupation site. There's lots and lots of worked flint, which has kept our colleague Ben Chan very busy. In fact, there are over 16,000 pieces of worked flint from our excavations to go with the equally thousands of numbers of worked flint that Keeler found. And we've been able to sort of play around looking at distributions of flint in total and different kinds of objects to see something of the kind of structure, the way in which activity took place within this site. But also combining what we have with the artifact scatter and with the few pits and other features that have been dug into the subsoil, the chalk underneath, we're also able to see that this site had a very long history. And it raises a very important point, which is that places can have long-term presence, but the nature of what goes on can flip backwards and forwards between things which are quite mundane and quotidian and things which are quite special, which is important to remember when you come to start to think about monuments. So we begin with a little bit of evidence of people being there in the Mesolithic, the last sort of hunter-gatherers in this landscape. But then in the early Neolithic, and probably within perhaps a few decades or a generation or two of the appearance of Neolithic communities in this landscape, we have a short phase of settlement. But then that's followed by the creation of what best seems to be a shrine, a small timber monument, which is probably quite sort of short-lived in its nature. So settlement through to perhaps some kind of marking and commemoration. There's then a long gap, and then we have a very significant phase of Middle Neolithic settlement, so dating to the end of the 4th millennium BC. And a very interesting phase, because we can see from the flint work that this is material which is actually coming in from all over the place, not just the region, but well beyond the region. And we think that this site is perhaps connected to people gathering and being involved in the construction of the first phase of the Avebury monument, features like the cove stone or the primary earthwork and so forth. So a site that probably became important because of that early phase of big scale monument building. There's then another gap, and then we see the site actually properly monumentalized when the line of the West Kennet Avenue is driven across the traces of the former Middle Neolithic occupation, and so representing another sort of transformation back into something monumental. Now, with other sites that we looked at, for example, Avebury Down, again, what we found was this sort of sense of places having duration, having history, of people kind of being drawn back to them. So again, the settlement here, and again, it covers a whole series of phases from the Mesolithic into the early Neolithic, Middle Neolithic, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, and Middle Bronze Age. It may be that in this particular case, that the importance of the site relates to its location on the slopes looking out to the west, looking out over the area of the Avebury monument. It affords a very good view of the Avebury henge itself. And certainly in the Middle and the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age phases, this was likely to be a very important part of its role. So what we can do, we can pull together all this sort of evidence from various bits of fieldwork we've done. We can think about the nature of places and whether they're short-lived, whether they're kind of locations where people keep returning to. We can think about the nature of the activity which happens within these locations, how that can kind of shift over time. And it builds up this picture of quite a lot of fluidity. Things, people come and go, places change, but often people are still drawn back to those same places. We can begin to sort of see the kind of rhythm and tempo of settlement. There's an awful lot going on in the early Neolithic, in the first 600 years of the 4th millennium BC. There's actually an awful lot going on in the Middle Neolithic, which is quite different from what we see in many other areas in southern Britain, where actually we see a contraction of activity in the Middle Neolithic, perhaps linked to quite a dramatic drop-off in population levels. But Avebury remains important, and of course that importance is reflected in the building of the first phase of the henge. And what we also see is that there's this phase right at the end of the Neolithic, say 2600, 2300, but really 2500, 2400 BC, where a lot of very energetic monument building is going on with the reworking of Avebury, construction of the avenues, building Silbury Hill, etc., etc. But that was the phase where we found it most difficult to find settlement evidence. But we think actually a lot of what was going on in terms of where people were living is linked to an earlier Neolithic site, Windmill Hill, which acted as a focus for significant gathering and settlement right throughout the Neolithic. And we know this from the work that's been done by early 20th century flint collectors. Now, the Living with Monuments project was very much focused on looking at these kind of occupation traces, but we were drawn to the West Kennet Palisades as a kind of monumental diversion, and partly because of the fact that at that monumental site there are also flint scatters that seem to represent areas of settlement. So we seem to have a monument that was intimately connected to settlement events. Now, the West Kennet Palisades are not well known. That's because they were built out of timber. And as you all know, one of the key qualities of timber is the fact that it rots. So, give it a century or two and you don't see any signs of the Palisades. And actually their existence was only really first sort of picked up through, first of all, through aerial photography, a little bit of excavation done in advance of a Ministry of Defence pipeline in the 1970s, but particularly through the work of Alistair Whittle during the late 80s, early 90s, when the late Neolithic date of these palisades was established, and something of their scale was established as well. Now, since Alistair Whittle's work, there's been further aerial photography, so we now have a good understanding of this complex, and it's massive. You know, it runs for about 1 kilometre by about half a kilometre in the bottom of the valley floor, close to Silby Hill, with an intimate connection to the River Kennet. One of the enclosures actually sort of spanning the River Kennet. Now, although Alistair Whittle's work established the date of the complex, there were still issues about whether or not it was a single event construction, what the connection was with the lithic scatters, whether there was kind of extramural occupation, and also just basic evidence about what on earth was going on with these structures. Because there's clearly evidence of gathering and feasting going on. We focused a lot on one of the outlying elements, structure 5. And there we found traces of a very, very substantial timber structure. It's difficult to see in that plan because what we actually found were loads and loads of features, some giant post holes, lots of pits, palisade, even a grave, and so forth. But out of this sort of mess of features, we were able to identify some pretty big post holes, 3 meters deep. So holding timbers that, even if they were freestanding, would have been sort of 15 meters perhaps above ground. If they were held together, linteled or part of a structure, could be even taller. And these forming a rectangular structure about 40 meters or so in length and breadth. So something equivalent to, if you like, Woodhenge, the Sanctuary, the Southern Circle at Durrington Walls, but rather curiously of a kind of rectangular rather than circular format. Now, monumental in its nature, but Richard Bradley has talked about these sorts of late Neolithic structures as perhaps representing houses. So they have a connection back to kind of lived worlds and to occupation. And he's talked about them being great houses and talked about them as structures which were built at a time when there was significant social change, and they kind of built, if you like, as a way of consolidating existing values in the face of change. Now, we know this was built in the 25th century BC. What could be going on in terms of a world of change at that time? Well, a very significant series of events, because this is the time when we start to see the in-migration of continental beaker groups into Britain, bringing with them metallurgy and all sorts of other things, but critically bringing in with them new belief systems and ideologies, which probably challenged the kind of belief systems and ideologies of existing late Neolithic communities. Hence, a sudden millenarian race to build massive structures in order to deal with that change. It's a very British response to dealing with things coming over from the continent. Now, we actually have evidence of these beaker individuals because we found the grave of 2 of them dug into one of the post holes. We also found around the bodies within that grave chunks of non-local stone, which we now know actually come all the way from Northumbria, from the Cheviot Hills, stuff called granodiorite. And this rock is present in some quantities in the grave and in pits dug into the tops of these post holes. But it is not known from any other Neolithic site in southern Britain. It's not even known anywhere else within the West Kennet Palisades. Now, it could be that this stone is somehow intimately connected to some of the beaker people who are buried in here, and hints at, perhaps long distance connections and identities which are being sort of played out. Now, if we come back to Avebury quickly, we've been doing work kind of around Avebury, down in the River Valley, Butlersfield, Winterbourne, around Avebury Manor Parkland. What we found rather curiously is that whereas there seem to be lots of traces of Neolithic settlement and activity to the east and to the southeast of the Henge, where we've been digging here, we've been finding plenty of Mesolithic activity, so to go with the last hunter-gatherers, but very, very little in the way of Neolithic settlement. And it may be that what we're seeing is the way in which the Henge is sat in a part of the landscape that divides it up into kind of zones between areas where people would gather and regularly lived, and other zones which were much more kind of reserved and not routinely used for settlement. We can also see through that work as well that the present sort of flat landscape hides a series of earlier river channels. And curiously, this may have something of a bearing on perhaps why Avebury is where it is. We can see through excavations and through the geoarchaeological work that Mike and Charlie did that we've got infilled channels which originally comprised a braided network, which survived as hollows, and very, very distinct hollows, right through to the end of the Iron Age. And it's only in the late Iron Age and Roman period they started to fill up with sediment that was washed in from ploughed fields around the area. So throughout the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and much of the Iron Age, were you to walk to the west of Avebury, you would see these big hollows. And of course, seasonally, during the winter and during the spring, those old channels would fill up with water and present a very sort of interesting and very kind of distinctive landscape. And perhaps it's that sort of seasonally fluctuating kind of waterscape that gave this location something of its special qualities, and in part sort of dictated why the Henge may have been situated where it was. But back to the Henge, and actually back to the beginnings of our Longstones project. And one of the first things we did, which sort of prefigures the Avebury Papers really, was rooting through Keeler's records and realizing that something that he had dug back in September 1939, which he wrote off as a medieval cart shed. Now, try and find a medieval cart shed. But this was in fact not a medieval cart shed, but this was the remains of an early Neolithic house. Now, it may be that in early September 1939, Keeler was a bit preoccupied by other things, so kind of took his eye off the ball a bit. But what we have are traces of a house right in the middle of the southern inner circle, a house that we can readily parallel with other examples from the early Neolithic in Ireland and more rarely in kind of lowland England. A sort of structure that wouldn't have been known at the time of Keeler's excavations. But what we did, recognizing the presence of these houses and recognizing that some of the stone settings that Keeler had found in the 1930s seemed to form a kind of rectilinear arrangement that mimicked the house, but at a much bigger scale, was to undertake a geophysical survey and duly find that the traces of that house were surrounded by a square of megaliths, with the house sat, if not quite centrally, but sort of relatively centrally positioned to that megalithic square. So what we think we have here is a sequence where, well before anyone thought of the Henge, well before anyone thought of putting up stone circles or stone squares, we have a house, and a house that perhaps is linked to individuals or a lineage of some significance, whose location was remembered, probably still visible as an earthwork after it went out of use. But it was so special that during the Middle Neolithic, it was monumentalized. It was surrounded by stone settings. And it's then a case where those stone settings become ever more complex and form successive kind of rings, if you like, around this central structure. Now, of course, we've got another inner circle. We've got the northern inner circle where we have the cove, which rather curiously, in terms of its original dimensions, would be quite similar to those of an early Neolithic house. So it may just be the case that we've got two early Neolithic buildings which provided the focal points for what would eventually be the creation of one of the great monuments of prehistoric Europe. And this leads to you know the issue that Mark raised about, you know, there's so much that we don't know, and there's so much that we could find out through targeted excavation. So there's lots we don't know about the date and status of various features. So the inner circles, we know some of the inner structures of the inner circles are Middle Neolithic, but are the inner circles themselves Middle Neolithic? What about that first phase of earthwork? Roughly it's Middle Neolithic, but quite when does it fit in? Lots of features as well, which come up to aerial photography, geophysical survey, we need to know more about. And ultimately, of course, we need to know how the Avebury story fits into a bigger story of phases of monument building and connectivity across Britain and Ireland during the Neolithic. Now, we know that, we'll never be able to do work on the same scale as Keeler, and we wouldn't want to do work on the same scale as Keeler, but actually with some very targeted excavation and good modern techniques, we can extract huge amounts of evidence, and the potential exists to really refine the Avebury story. So if there's going to be a what next, then that is it. Okay, thank you. I shall stop sharing.